Hello, everyone, and welcome to the August 29th edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk Meeting. My name is Richard Brown. I am the 50th. Oh my God. Somebody should have got me a cake. What's going on? All right. The 50th edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk Meeting. My name is Richard Brown. I am the head of community development. I lost that for a second, but I'm back. I'm going to keep things short and sweet because I think that we are trying to come up with ways to make these calls slightly more dynamic than they have been. We're iterating over time and things have been going well. I'm happy with these calls, enormously happy, but there's still room for improvement, and I want to try and raise the signal to noise slightly and also mix things up a bit. I'm trying to convince Cyrus that starting with governance every week is unfair because of all the influence there and emphasis we put on the governance stuff, and risk kind of gets squeezed sometimes. So we might be alternating on each one of these calls. Today we're going to start off with governance. Next week potentially we'll start off with risk, so everybody has an opportunity to put some emphasis on the parts of these calls excuse me, that they find most compelling. Oh yeah, the preamble, I almost forgot. We want to hear from our community, and this is a really great way to get immediate feedback, and it's also a great way to ping people in the foundation. If you have questions or comments, please type them into the chat at the side window. If you have a microphone, please get on the mic and interrupt us. We don't mind. I think that's it for preambles. Do we have LongForWisdom? He is here. So I'm not going to dig too deeply into all the interesting things that are happening in the forum, although those are mostly some of the things that I want to talk about today. I'll allow him to do the color commentary, but I am going to remind people that we have two forum polls happening right now that are watershed moments in the history, the epic history of MakerDAO governance. This is the first time that we've had a forum poll that will provide a signal to initiate a governance poll. And this is a long conversation that we probably might not get into today unless people have questions about that. But we needed to figure out how do we initiate a governance poll, and then in order to gather signals from the wider community, the maker holders, sorry. And the question arose, well, how do we achieve enough signals to initiate a governance poll in the portal? The answer, after a great deal of discussion and back and forth, was the forum is the place to do that. And this is the first example of that activity occurring. So after I talk for a bit, I'm going to post some links to those forum threads. Please familiarize yourselves with the conversations leading up to that poll, and make your voice heard. And then we'll see how governance actually works in practice, which is going to be exciting. The other thing I want to talk about, actually, yeah, I'm going to keep things kind of philosophical, and I want to put some questions out there. And this is going to be an experiment because I keep on saying that I'm super interested in hearing from the community. We want to get all this feedback, and then I basically say go, and then everybody's surprised at that, and we don't get a lot of questions. So I want to try and mix it up a bit. And what I'm going to do this call for the governance section is I want to throw some questions out there, some things for people to think about, and then pick them up at the end of the hour during the Q&A session and see if anything had percolated by the time that the call is over. And then we'll dig into some things. And here's what I want to talk about, or I want the community to think about, because they're kind of hot button topics. Actually, I don't know if I'm using that phrase correctly. They're popular topics in the general conversation around governance, and they are these. Is delegation a thing that we should do? And it's an interesting conversation because somebody pointed this out, I think it was Quadrax in the forums, and I've had the same, probably I had a different reaction, but I had the same amount of interest in the fact that this has happened, because we're in a space where, depending on how crypto-anarchic your roots are, the general intention here is that it's self-sovereignty, and it's taking control of your destiny, and it's having a say in the decision-making process. And one of the interesting things we've seen, and I understand completely, is that that kind of a world is tremendously complicated and involves a lot of work, and maybe not everybody wants to do that. And so if I had to guess, and this is anecdotal, I haven't taken any polls, but the #1 requested feature when it comes to the governance ecosystem is some kind of delegation mechanism, so people can kind of be relieved of this enormous responsibility of researching MakerDAO 4 hours a week, every week, to figure out what's going on. Lots of people want to identify experts or people that align with their general interests and have some kind of mechanism that would let them transfer their state maker to a third party. That's a very interesting conversation to have. And the questions that we've been sort of wrestling with is, how does that happen? And I personally, I don't speak for the foundation on this, but I personally am extremely reluctant to add additional layers of complexity and baking those into the foundation created governance and ecosystem. I think the great way to move forward would be to follow the same principles that the crypto space and open source in general has, is that MakerDAO generates these financial primitives, it generates contracts, and then the third party, the community, comes in and builds the tooling on those primitives that they'd like to see. And I think that we can look at the governance ecosystem in the same way that we look at the protocol itself, the DeFi protocol that we're building itself. And so that is leading me up to posting this link in the chat. And this is a link to HackMD that Chris Hobcroft has put together. He has he's been working with Aragon, or on Aragon, I should say, with DAOs for a while, and he has some really interesting ideas about how to extend Aragon with connectors to allow it to do other things. So a group of people could get together and self-organize and then put some assets into Compound, or they could do anything with an external dApp, but organized through Aragon. I think that's a very compelling idea. I pinged him after I read about his Nest application and suggested that how about you do something like that for governance, because this seems like a really great way for the community to begin to self-organize. Groups of people could say, hey, I like the way you think. I'm also enormously conservative, or I'm also frustrated at the lack of aggression in the system. There's all kinds of camps. These people can get together, they can fire up an Aragon DAO. They can use the mechanisms outlined in that link that I just posted to somehow safely pool their maker together and elect a voter that would keep up with activities in the governance system and behave in a way that the group finds acceptable. It's a long and interesting conversation, and we're looking for interest from the community, people to offer up some suggestions about use cases and mechanisms. If there's deeply technical people in the community that understand how Aragon works and or have deep insight into how the proxies, DS proxy and the chief works at MakerDAO, please hop into that HackMD and offer up some suggestions, or feel free to reach out to Chris. We can put some contact information in the bottom of that HackMD, which I don't think I did. That's a great example of how we're really looking for the community to solve the problems of the community. And the foundation is here. Excuse me, that was rude. The foundation is here to facilitate that activity. So we would certainly love to give Chris and his team a grant to solve a problem that makes life for the community easier. So if you're interested, have a look at that HackMD. And I also, okay, so at the beginning of my speech, I threatened to throw out some questions that I'd like for people to ponder, and then we can pick them up potentially at the end of the hour. And these are going to sound silly, but I think that they're important, and they're going to be hard questions. These are capital H hard questions. But what I would like people to start thinking about is what is consensus? And that sounds dumb, but it's something that's worth thinking about, because a lot of the times, or frequently when we're thinking about governance, we have a habit of falling into shorthand and euphemisms without realizing it. And consensus is one of those shorthands, at least when it comes to social consensus. consensus mechanisms, there's no ambiguity about it. But when it comes to people talking about things in a group, figuring out when consensus has been reached and how much consensus is enough, and all the other ambiguities around that thing are enormously difficult. And so when it comes to the forums, when it comes to these debates, when it comes to those the governance facilitator mandate thread or the risk team mandate threads, these are questions we need to start answering. At what point was consensus reached? Is there consensus? How much consensus is good enough consensus? When do we start a poll? Do we, sorry, I immediately leapt into the second question I wanted to ask, but here we go. We have this debate. A mandate has appeared in the forum. Does that mandate come with a poll immediately? Do people signal their support or dissent for that mandate before the debate happens? What happens if that poll or if that mandate changes materially based on the debate, yet people have already voted on that poll? Can we expect them to come back and update their votes? If not, actually, I'm obviously asking leading questions. It's not going to be hard to figure out which way I'm leaning on this. But if we wait X number of days after a mandate has been posted for a debate to occur and then a poll to get posted, how long does that poll exist in the forum before we consider that done? Yeah, so these are interesting questions. And happily, we have LongForWisdom in our back pocket, and he's set up a really great thread in the forums as well that I want people to keep on revisiting, and that is the signaling guidelines thread. David, can you dig that up for me? I had it in another window, but I lost it somehow in the last 10 minutes. And this is another great example of emergent process that's happening in these in the forum, where as we go along, we're figuring out how things should work, or how they work for us at least, and we're refining that. And I would love for people to take a look at the signaling guidelines thread and refine it, help us to refine this, because this is going to be the kind of documentation that comes out of the forum and ends up going into our portal and ends up being canonical. And we're expecting people to follow these social conventions or these governance conventions as we come up with them. Actually, maybe I'll leave that for the philosophical questions. Let's think about consensus and let's think about debate for today. At the end of the hour, if anyone has questions about governance facilitation, the way that conversation occurred, anything about the hard questions in governance or signaling, let's chat about it at the end of the hour, and we'll have like a governance Q&A. But at this point, my 15 minutes are up. I'm going to hand it over to you, LongForWisdom, if you want to give us a recap of the forum, assuming I haven't stolen all the good parts already.
Yeah, can do. So I guess the thread with the most sort of engagement this week was the why aren't maker holders voting thread. So to sort of give a bit of background on this, I posted a thread on Reddit sort of encouraging people to vote and get involved more. We got, which had sort of mixed results. Some people, there were a couple of people who did appear, which is awesome. We also got a big list of reasons that people don't vote. And so I've basically summarized or correlated those in that thread in the original post, and everyone's been discussing them, which has been good because we've come up with a couple of things, a couple of ways to mitigate some of them, and recognize that some of them are probably beyond scope at the moment. So my hope is that in that thread we can look at the others and then sort out which ones are things we can actually do something about as a community and which ones we can't at the moment. So that's sort of current affairs. The other current affairs thing that's probably worth mentioning is that not so much in the forum but in chat. So we'll get onto that later, obviously. But yeah, in terms of we've now got polls up on the mandate for risk teams and interim governance facilitators. So suggest signaling on those, discussing any points that you think are still open. One other thing I'm going to sort of bang the drum for again is this signal request to moving towards exponential rate stepping for stability fee polls. So I brought this up last week, I'll bring it up again. We're now at 62% consensus, I believe, with 24 voters last time I checked. So definitely got a couple more people voting since last week. But we still sort of lack a really strong sort of, obviously 62% is a majority, but we don't have a really strong mandate for sort of implementing a specific option yet. The general consensus seems to be that we want to move to exponential stepping, with the exception of Cyrus. Everyone was in favor. But there's sort of disagreement over what the best way to do that is. Within the main threads, so I'll leave that there unless anyone has questions.
Can I ask just one quick question about that? Without kind of, maybe it's better saved for the end of the call, but what is the harm if we have basically a fundamental this idea of going to exponential rate or not? If we have a system now that allows for multiple votes that go and can all happen in parallel, where do we reach the point where we just say, just put it to a vote and move on?
Yeah, that's one of the hard questions that I'm hoping people can talk about at the end, because that's when does consensus happen? And I think that if we wait for overwhelming consensus, or we wait for enough consensus, or rough, like these are all very, very murky questions to ask. And so potentially one of the solutions or one of the possibilities I want to throw out there is that we, when we initiate, we have this debate, the debate goes on for this, we can make it arbitrary. Exponential rate stepping, we're going to talk about this for 2 weeks. That's the window. After 2 weeks are over, automatically a forum poll will start. That forum poll will last for 7 days, and that's the window for people to get in there and signal. And after that, based on those results, it just either something happens or something doesn't. I think that not having a calendar, and that's why calendaring is built in so heavily into the governance facilitator mandate, is that as we're mapping out this role, that became increasingly obvious. One of the most important things is somebody needs to be able to establish a start and stop date and make sure that things happen on time. And I think we're kind of seeing the evidence of that with the exponential rate stepping and the governance, or not, sort of the stability fee vote thing, because this has been going on forever. We need to, well, potentially we need to have a better rate stepping, and we need to consider not voting on the stability fee every single week. And without a facilitator to set up these arbitrary deadlines, I think that the chances of it moving ahead are pretty slim.
And to add on just one extra commentary, and we'll get probably to the end of it, but I also don't think we should set with the mindset that a decision is a perpetual decision forever and that it could never be readdressed. I mean, it's not the Supreme Court. I mean, we're allowed to, if we implement exponential rate stepping and we don't like it after 6 months, we could always put together another vote to undo it. It doesn't perpetually push it off the table for discussion. Yeah, and that's great. Thank you for raising that point. And this is something I think that we might not be stressing enough in these calls and in the ecosystem, or in the governance ecosystem in general, is that we're not releasing proclamations here. Well, maybe, but you know what I'm talking about. Like, this is all iterative. Like, we're releasing. This is why I keep on saying that this is open source governance, and we can look at governance as being code, because we come up with our best efforts based on the information available to us. We release that to the community. The governance facilitator mandate, the rate stepping, the risk team mandate, anything that comes out of this ecosystem is designed to get us 2 or 3 or 4, 6 months down the road. If it turns out that we need to course correct, then it's trivial to have another vote. And then update the governance facilitator mandate, update the rate stepping, update the cadence of the stability fees. So everything is up for debate. And I think that was addressed in one of the forum threads where I think it was a criticism of Cyrus's doc, where in the mandate, the risk team mandate said this is a living document. And I think that it was interpreted as the forum thread is a living document, but it's not. These mandates are living documents. They evolve constantly. That's our expectation. If these were written in stone, it'd be disastrous, because we can't predict the future. We need to respond to new pressures as they arise. And so everything here is hopefully going to be iterated every time we find a flaw in the system. All right, sorry, LongForWisdom, was that the end of governance at a glance?
Yeah, pretty much. I have fairly strong feelings about the things we were talking about, but I'll save them for the QA. So.
Yeah, I think that's probably going to be a good opportunity. We should, at the end of the hour, let's dig into this resurrect rate stepping. Let's resurrect
stability fee cadences, and everything else that's actually in these threads, as opposed to pointing out which ones are great. I think at this point, let's hand it off to Risk. Cyrus, do you want to take it away? Actually, you're on some kind of jet train.
Can you guys hear me?
Fantastic location. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, a couple interesting things to talk about today in Risk. Before we jump into the die price, I'm going to do a quick review of last week's Risk team mandate and see if there are any outstanding questions. And then I'm going to address a point that was brought up in the forum thread, which I thought was really good. Okay, so essentially, the Risk team mandate is a proposal for a structure for risk teams and how they are onboarded into the governance system, and what kind of documentation we can expect from them. And when I say we, I mean what the MKR holders can and or should expect from them. Basically, it's our attempt to deal with a little bit of the chaos that could result from just completely decentralized risk process. That being said, certain areas were kept maybe intentionally vague because, as Rich said, a lot of governance is hard to predict, and we don't want to be over-committal in certain aspects of it. At the same time, though, we wanted to set a high bar for quality in terms of the professionalism and diligence that we can expect from the risk constructs. So that being said, does anyone have any outstanding questions from the risk team mandate?
I had a question basically about like, is it going to be a
Okay,
hiring?
cool. So there were.
Oh. Sorry, Cyrus, did you hear me? Can you hear me, Cyrus?
No, sorry. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I just had one question.
Yeah,
like,
can you?
Yeah, I'm repeating it. So the one question I had was around basically how we hire individual people within these risk teams. Do they like I know in the mandate it kind of envisioned people like posting up their resumes and credentials and like what they'll be focusing on and stuff. But do you see this, like, do you see people having an issue with doing this publicly on the individual level?
That's a good question. I don't think so, but actually that kind of ties into the question I wanted to address anyways. So I'll just jump into that. I think it was Quadrax or somebody on the forum who mentioned, are there risk teams behind the scenes, or what's the actual status update on that? And I responded that there isn't some hidden behind the scenes, slew of risk teams waiting in line. And how we envision that to happen is essentially, I think we're going to try to lean on community support, community outreach, not necessarily from our community, but communities of the collateral partners. So, for example, if some collateral partner, whether it's a crypto asset or not, wants to onboard their asset into MCD, basically currently what's happening is they're just generally coming to us on the interim risk team and saying, we love you guys, we want to become part of the project. And I think on their end, they don't realize that there's essentially like 20, 30 independent projects trying to kind of work their way into MCD. And at a certain level, it just becomes completely infeasible for us to handle the entire process for all of the projects. So what we're doing is we're trying to, I kind of view my role as a facilitator to help coordinate with the collateral partner the search for an independent risk team who can come along and work on the risk evaluation for these collateral assets. So for example, some of our collateral partners are a Danish company looking to make small business loans in Copenhagen. Another is South American logistics company, and so forth. And it's very globally diverse, and it doesn't really make sense for us to try to become experts in everything out there. At the same time, these, it's not entirely responsible to have the collateral partners propose their own risk parameters, even though in many cases they have done a lot of the work themselves. So essentially, we're working with our collateral partners to help source independent risk analysts, and that could be either community members, or it could be professional firms, professional consultants, accounting firms, whomever. So there's a few different ways to do it. But I think essentially it will be driven by the community of the collateral partner. And to be clear, if we do get around to it, we're happy to do it ourselves. I'm just purely speaking from a priority perspective. So we did have the priority poll a few weeks ago, right? And we have to, at some point, estimate our pace of work and how long it would take us to get through the list. If the community of a particular project says, you know what, this is going to take too long, then they're more than happy to kind of push forward a independent risk team and go from there. In terms of the public credentials question that you mentioned, you find, right, if it's some professional firm that handles this stuff on the daily, then that kind of makes total sense. I think in all cases it should be fine. I'd have to hear some edge cases to think about why that wouldn't work. But the broader question should really be is, to what extent can all of MakerDAO's processes be public? And that's an issue that I do think we'll run into eventually, especially in terms of data sets that potentially sensitive data that risk teams might use to evaluate these collateral partners. That will be an interesting obstacle when we get to it. Does that make sense? I hope I didn't cut out.
Yeah, I think that made sense. You didn't cut off too badly throughout the answer.
Okay.
I had the additional question, if you have just a minute. I had the additional question of, do you have a sense of who or what will be the real first example of this? I know that the priority list results listed ETH first, Rep second, BAT third, so it might be a bit premature to even ask my question, but do you expect people from the Rep community, for example, to have somebody who's really technically knowledgeable about Rep and all of the tech, for example, to cover the technical risks? Do you see that as maybe the first example of what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's probably going to be the first example. Whether I imagine, well, the current plan is for the interim risk team to evaluate ETH plus BAT and Rep, and so I totally expect us to kind of make some contacts on that front. But that's just kind of as part of our information gathering. But I could also see, so for example, we've had some other crypto assets that weren't part of the first priority list. They've already completed the onboarding collateral application, and they are essentially just getting ready to post it to the forums. And then when they do that, we might kind of bring up a discussion of, okay, well, first they would get added to the next priority poll, and in the meantime, we could encourage their community to put forth someone who can do an objective analysis of the collateral asset or aid the interim risk team in doing their evaluation. But yeah, the kind of the specific answer is we don't know, right? We don't know exactly how that would look.
Cool. Thanks for the answer.
Cool. Okay. Well, that being said, I think the risk team mandate. Yeah, for sure. I think the risk team mandate, just like the governance facilitator, will kind of be an ongoing dialogue over the coming weeks and months. So I'm going to leave it there for now, if there are no other questions. And then we can jump into the monetary policy. And I think there are a few interesting things to talk about there today as well. Vishesh, if you're on the call, do you mind taking over?
Sure. Okay, I'll just share my screen. Okay. Can you guys see the graph? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So just in the last 24 hours, pretty significant amount of DAI traded. The volume weighted average price just a cent or so above $1. And then if we look at the last 7 days, the DAI price was trading, roughly a cent to 2 cents above $1, with interestingly fairly average 7-day trading volume. So it was pretty quiet, and then front loaded to the last 2 or 3 days or so. Yeah, I mean, you see kind of classic microstructures here, just pretty well centered around, like I said, approximately a cent above $1. I think some of this was due to a little bit of releveraging, so that's something that we can touch on. So what's interesting is that in the short term, what we'd seen is a lot of draws and wipes canceling each other out, but actually in the last day or two, we did see a little bit more wipe than minting. And then in collateral terms, we saw things were pretty quiet, but collateral does periodically get added as the ETH price falls. And then what we can see here is in terms of liquidations, there were some liquidations recently, but not as much as when ETH dipped about 2 weeks ago. So that price has been kind of slowly coming down a bit, which I know a lot of people are not happy about. But what's interesting is maybe we can look a little bit at the leverage to kind of understand that. So let me just go over here. So some of the cumulative graphs. Essentially, this ETH price has been coming down pretty consistently for the first part of 2019. There was sort of a run up, and now it's come back down again to basically just end of 2018 levels, or slightly below. Yeah, I mean, it was roughly November, December when the price was last at this level. So what's interesting is the amount of collateral that had been locked in the system was consistently growing. The amount of collateral that was being removed from the system voluntarily was actually being outpaced initially in the first part of 2019 and picked up pace in mid-2019 and has now sort of flatlined. And this makes total sense because essentially as that ETH price was running up a little bit, there was some excitement, a little bit of releveraging, a little bit of taking some collateral out because it had risen in dollar terms. And now with the drop, this is pretty flat, or even somewhat slightly increasing, but more or less outpaced by the amount of collateral being added. So this is a behavior that I think we now can pretty consistently say is expected. So essentially, as the ETH price takes a hit, people will stop pulling collateral out and they'll actually start putting some more in. And as the ETH price rises and people are feeling bullish, they'll feel more comfortable pulling collateral out. So this is pretty well explained phenomenon at this point. What's been happening in terms of debt and supply? So essentially, over time, we'd kind of seen this consistent increase in the DAI supply. And so what you saw was essentially this draw line was growing and growing and growing and growing pretty rapidly. But the wipe line in terms of voluntary shuts and wipes had essentially kept pace initially and then sort of gotten outpaced by the amount of debt that was being minted, but just in the last few months had ticked up and accelerated and started to close the gap. And so that's where you started to see this DAI supply start to come down. There were also some liquidations, but then we essentially see this precipice around mid-July where just, that draw amount is still somewhat consistently growing, slowing down a little bit, but then that wipe line has just accelerated rapidly. What's interesting is since, maybe the last couple of weeks, that wipe line has also slowed down. So the supply has actually been at a relatively steady state. So even though in the week time frame, it does look like there's a bit more wipe than draw, in the grand scheme of things, it's still pretty comparatively flat. And then we see in the longer time scale as well, so essentially that ETH price, as it takes those hits, there are some slight stepwise jumps in the amount of debt that's liquidated. And so, you saw huge jumps at the end of 2018, still pretty unparalleled. And then some slight jumps around some of these smaller dips at the beginning of 2019, in April turn of the month, and then a somewhat significant one just like again in that same mid-July timeframe. So a couple of smaller ones 2 weeks ago, and then very small one very recently. But by and large, people have been, I guess you could say, managing this risk better and collateralizing their CDPs to counteract some of these risks. So yeah, we can see again the collateral amount in nominal terms versus the ETH price, essentially just a converse relationship, and that collateral amount has come down a little bit during the bull market and then sort of recovered and keeping comparatively flat in the last couple of weeks. And again, this is just ETH price versus the debt. Not a super strong relationship between these two. So one thing that I did want to touch on was, so we saw a lot of these trades happening in the past week or so. Let me reduce the variability of DAI price has been comparatively lower, I think, than some of what we'd seen in the past. So if we pull up an older graph here, you'll recall that we had seen some pretty significant variability in DAI price in the beginning of 2019. And essentially the standard deviation of that, just go back to a couple of weeks ago, the standard deviation of that had sort of come down a bit, and this price, though it is hovered sometimes above, sometimes below $1, has actually decreased that spread quite a bit. And so what's interesting is even this is a pretty significant spread for the past couple of months, but pretty tight, just hovering either slightly above or slightly below $1. So DAI is comparatively pretty stable, is I think the takeaway there, though at the moment trading slightly above. And what's interesting is this is even post the most recent stability fee change. It's had a few days to normalize, and we haven't seen a huge change in what's been going on with DAI price. So I am fairly confident, whether it's correct or not, there's going to be, and I've seen this in the forums and the chats, some people pushing to lower that stability fee again. Listen, in terms of addressing that potential proposal, the collateral amount is something that I want to look at. So this collateral value in the past 2 weeks or so has been comparatively stable. Collateral has actually come up slightly since the 18.5% stability fee decrease. So what's interesting is, and there were a small amount of liquidations, so that's really where that comes from. So stability fee drop, this change really doesn't have much to do with the stability fee. Supply has actually come down slightly. It's come back up in the last few hours, just a hair, but basically it was sitting around 78 million for the past couple of weeks, tick down very slightly, tick back up very slightly. So not a ton of movement there despite the stability fee change. So there's not a huge impact on leveraging behavior, which I know has been one of the worries that we have is when we lower the stability fee, the potential that you're just going to incentivize significant amounts of releveraging and crash the DAI price. That hasn't really happened in the past couple of days, although the DAI price, I would say, is also probably propped up by a little bit of purchasing behavior. Is the most likely explanation of this. So yeah, ironically, though changes are being made somewhat quiet on the Maker front. Yeah, I guess maybe we can open these up to questions, and hopefully I won't eat up all the time this time.
So Vishesh, I have a quick question, and I want to echo the sentiment that I saw in the chat earlier today. I think there was a bit of urgency in how consistently DAI has been trading above the peg, and I know that a lot of people are should we? I just see in the conversations that there's a big tendency to have an emotional response that triggers overshooting or something, and
Yeah.
also there's concerns about whether or not we can make the change quickly enough in response to these kinds of situations. So yeah, I don't know if you want to comment about that, because I feel it's a bit of an outsized reaction from what I've been reading.
Sure. So I want to just flash back to here maybe. Okay, so early July was probably one of the more quote unquote urgent moments of, hey, DAI is taking consistent hits. We should increase the stability fee. This was also probably prior to having some visibility on what's been going on with secondary markets. So, even then, we weren't really talking as much about utilization rates and things like that, which have ticked up slightly since the 18.5% stability fee increase, which is actually pretty interesting. So DAI has gotten slightly cheaper. Utilization has held pretty steady or actually increased. So what that means is, from a scientific standpoint, those are actually metrics that you could use to justify making a case for a stability fee decrease. Is there anything that I see that is sort of prompting worry or concern that DAI price is too high? No, it's, again, maybe a cent or two above by and large. Of course, there's a spread always, but in general, the bulk of the trading over the past week is just a cent or two above. So there's nothing urgent about it in my eyes. I don't see any of that in any of these graphs. That being said, could you make the case for, okay, the fee was decreased and everything was more or less fine, so you could potentially decrease it again? Yes, that case could certainly be made. I would, again, prompt maybe thinking about small changes, 0.5%, 1%, and I know we've been having this other thread about how should polling be structured and all that, what should the options be, but just in terms of making well-founded, careful, non-rash decisions, dropping by 0.5% to check and make sure that this will continue to stay steady and that you can offer the best rates possible does not seem unfounded at this point. But no, I don't see in either direction at the moment anything for concern. Like I said, it's actually been comparatively quiet.
So to respond to that, so like I know the governance poll just concluded with the community agreeing to lower the fee to 16.5%, or at least not to lower the fee, but to put an executive vote to lower the fee to 16.5%, which is 2% down, rather than like a
Yep.
smaller 0.5% move. And I think that the main concern is that DAI is trading so consistently for so long above $1, because it hasn't just been 7 days that this has been going on. I think it's been almost 2 weeks, if I'm not mistaken. And so does the duration of DAI trading above the peg, even if it's just a cent or a cent and a half or something, does that warrant like a bigger move down? I mean, we could always readjust next week, right? If it's an outsized move.
I wouldn't say it's a larger amount would be warranted. The real question, and it goes back to supply and demand and when they're in equilibria, right? And if both of those two items are static, demand, we will figure out what the supply should be. The issue is that we don't know what demand is. We can control supply, and we're using the stability fee to try and find where demand is, but it's just elusive. We can't quantify it yet. The question really becomes, well, I mean, and yes, if we can quantify it, and if it's growing, and if demand is in the driver's seat right now, we're just on a unicycle, and we have pushed on one side, now we've passed over an equilibrium, and now we have to accelerate to catch ourselves. That's the challenge we have in single collateral DAI, right? And that's really the question. Is there a need to do more than that? No, I don't think either. I would prefer that we just take consistent. I agree that it should be a smaller number. The community's agreed on 2%, fine, but we should do something on a reoccurring basis to get back to an issue. We don't cross back the unicycle so far that we over adjust.
Yeah, so I think there were a lot of things that you just brought up in quick hit, and David, I want to address your initial question as well. So the one thing is, I do think from a process management standpoint, consistent small changes when supported by fact is a good way of approaching things rather than large sudden stochastic changes in rapid succession. Like as a process management principle, I do think that holds. The other thing, so addressing 0.5% versus 2%, et cetera. I mean, you've heard me many times sort of advocate for these smaller percent changes relatively regularly rather than sudden 2% changes infrequently. So, if you were to draw like a 2x2 grid in terms of frequency and severity of changes, I do think that the smaller frequent changes is going to yield superior results than large infrequent changes, which is more or less how things have been going. I mean, I'm calling 2% large, and again, that's like a discussion point. But yes, I will advocate for these smaller changes because just the bigger the change, the greater the likelihood that you're going to over or undershoot. So just that's a process management principle point. Now, as far as like what's actually going on, so the cash is a really interesting thing to look at. So I just filtered down to sort of that same August 20th range that we were looking at for the price here. So the point, David, that you made that I want to address, that DAI has consistently been trading, well above $1. Like I don't think that that's necessarily true. DAI has been trading a bit above $1 and a little bit more above $1 than it has below $1, but really like the bulk of that DAI has been trading maybe a cent or two above, and then even occasionally, a cent or half a cent below. So I don't think there's some huge imbalance going on right now, but it is obvious that it is slightly above. I think when slightly above, maybe make slight considerations, and I think that's we've long tried to get to a rule or a mathematical formula on like how much should you change, how often. I think generally that's hard to do. If you hold one variable constant and you say, okay, the frequency is going to be a relatively consistent or constant variable, then you can isolate the other variable of magnitude and start to think about that more formulaically. One really simple way would be, okay, if you keep fairly consistent changes on a scale of, say, 0.5% to 1% with some grades in between, or 0 to 1.5% with some grades in between, and then you determine how far on that scale you want to go based on how above or below a dollar DAI has been trading. That would be a really simple way of doing it. A little bit more refined way would be to start to look at, hey, we have X amount of excess DAI on secondary lending platforms for X amount of time, and coming up with a really simple formula of saying, hey, that should translate to Y% change in stability fee, would maybe be a little bit more refined, or maybe some combination of the two. So as we start to think about better ways of thinking about these things, I think those are things to take into consideration. But again, it does not appear to me that in either direction there is any sense of urgency, emergency, or extreme conditions going on with regards to DAI specifically. When it comes to ETH, yes, there's definitely some reasons to worry about what's been going on lately. And there have been pretty significant movements in terms of price. So,
Actually,
that
Vishesh,
long run average, yes.
before you get into the next bit, could I just comment on the frequency thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're sort of talking about frequency like it's fairly consistent. And the way the polls work, we put the polls out consistently, but because the executives run until they pass, right? The actual changes to the system don't come consistently. So
They don't.
as you're sort of talking about like isolating variables, would it be easier to isolate the other variables, to isolate the change variable to like 2%, which seems to be the favorite of like whales currently, and then try and figure out the frequency, how quickly or like how much time it takes to take into effect, I guess? Or,
yeah.
You get what I'm coming at.
Fair question. I don't think it would be easier to try to isolate magnitude over frequency. I understand that there are some structural reasons why frequency can be a bit unpredictable, but it's sort of like, I don't know if I'm going to buy or sell something, but I know when I'm going to buy or sell it, seems a little bit more sensible than I know when I'm going to make a transaction. I have no idea what kind of transaction I'm going to make. I don't know. It does not seem to me to make a whole lot of sense of like, okay, we're going to make a 2% change no matter what. And then it's either going to be positive or negative depending on what everything looks like on, say August 1st and then August 19th and so on and so forth. That does seem a little bit tough. I don't know. These are not easy problems, but
let's also
I
look
do
at it.
think.
Sorry, just to carry on to that thinking. It's like if you imagine right now you're viewing it as a frequency of what happens every other week or 10 days or versus 14 days, but just view it as an entire calendar year. How many votes do we actually get implemented on an entire calendar year basis? The frequency mix, if it's plus or minus a day or a week, one extra vote or one less vote really should smooth out over the course of an entire calendar year.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you're two days ahead, 2 days behind, here and there, as long as you're making sensible moves that are based on, say at least a week's worth of data, it shouldn't be a huge deal. I think that becomes significantly more problematic when you're trying to make changes on 2-3 day timescales, which again, I didn't address, frequent versus infrequent, but I've always, been a proponent of making more, slower changes. They can be regular, they can be, somewhat predictable, etc. But, making changes within a 3-day timescale or based on 3 days of data, for example, just never seems to be a good idea. And I think if you look at cases where I was just sort of looking at the history of Maker here. if you look at cases where multiple changes were made, in quick succession, I think more or less they were then reversed, undone, or had to be otherwise addressed. So I think from a scientific standpoint, as we start to build this history of data points, there's not a lot of data points right now, which is why historical analysis is tough. But my guess is the trend on this is those were cases of over and undershooting. And so it does seem to be that the system is not managed as tightly when changes are made in rapid succession. So I don't know, it will be interesting to see what comes out of the next change or so, but I do think, if you're making 2% changes within, what was this? This was 4 days and 4 days, like you tend to get into some interesting scenarios where it's maybe not the best management of the system. Sorry, I know it's eating up a lot of time.
No, I want to jump in there because you just said something that's interesting, because we've talked about, let's change the exponential rate to exponential rate stepping. Let's change the cadence to 2 weeks because that just makes sense to humans. But what you just pointed out, though, is that we can look back at this empirical data that we have and see that all things being equal, which they never are in this space, but we can see that if we bunch up a pile of votes together in a 3-week period, then traditionally we end up undoing that change in X number of weeks afterwards. Can we come up with sort of this algorithmically sane cadence on voting and rate stepping based on past data, or are there just too many confounding variables in the market for us to be able to just look at the graph to see what we should be doing?
I unfortunately think it's a lack of history problem. There's just not enough data points to make like statistically significant conclusions on questions like that. But I do think from common sense, well, maybe, yeah, from at a certain point. But I do think from a common sense standpoint, we can evaluate this question of saying, if you have less than a week of market data to make a decision, you're probably not making the right decision, or you should have a very low confidence in whatever decision you're making, and it's more or less a coin toss of whether or not you're doing the right thing. That seems pretty reasonable. But you look at these changes, like they're kind of clustered, right? And back at this point, you consider February to end of March, these were spaced out a little bit more. And I think these changes, there was a very high degree of confidence that they were in the right direction. Now, it's a lot easier when we're talking about 1 to 7.5%. But then there's this, sort of odd spacing between 7.5 to 11.5. And then from 11 to 19.5 was in rapid succession. And then, maybe less than a month later, less than a month later, then it was unwound and the fee was dropped again.
Well, we can interpret it a different way too, because it's not necessarily, we can't necessarily attribute this to rational activity as well, though. It could be that people are just simply chasing a penny above or below and hoping that what they just did had an effect, though, right?
Well, isn't that what's happening right now?
Well, that's a matter. That's open for discussion, I guess.
Well, I mean, it does seem right. So there was a appetite for a drop for a pretty long time, and then that drop was recently made. I mean, I don't know if I have a longer time scale on this graph. I don't, but this was sitting at 20.5% for quite a while, and then the 18.5% drop was made, and now we're already talking about another drop. But then why was it sitting at 20.5% for so long is another question of, this is not a very responsive system, and I know Cyrus doesn't want this to be like a day-to-day change kind of thing, or purely dynamic, purely algorithmic. And I think there's a lot of reasons that make a lot of sense for not having that kind of the system, but maybe it is a bit on the other extreme of kind of choppy, where it's not about it being too slow or too fast. I think it's maybe about the lack of predictability, the lack of seemingly logic behind when the changes are made, and then magnitude is something we can talk about. But again, when you're going to limit to kind of really small changes or really big changes, or something in the middle being 2%, I think more often than not, people are going to end up choosing that middle kind of ground of, and I think 2% is what they've kind of landed on of, okay, well, we're not going to sit here and monitor the system all the time. We're not going to sit here and make decisions about Maker all the time, speaking for, Maker holders. And so I think they've decided when we do decide to make a change, we're going to make a 2% change and try to make sure it's in the right direction. And that seems to me like a balancing of the costs of, monitoring and management and trying to make actual changes and have the system be responsive. So
is it too early to make some assumptions about why these things happen? So obviously stability of the peg is priority number one, but it feels to me like there'd be different levels of reluctance when it comes to raising and or lowering. Have you seen any evidence that the community is happier to raise it than it is to lower it, or to lower it than it is to raise it?
It's almost like there's two communities. I don't know, is maybe a more cogent explanation, but it seems to be that there's like different voices that take over at different times, is kind of how it feels. And I think there is a set of people that are more likely to advocate loudly for decreases, and it seems like there's a set of people that speak up more when we're talking about increases. And it seems at the moment, I don't know, somebody was saying doves in the chat, but whoever this group of people is that tend to advocate for these drops is speaking up at the moment.
Should we? Well, I'm going to ask you what we should do. So I don't know how much you love that. Should the community be trying to err on the side of lowering, or should they be erring on the side of, or should it be focused more on stability regardless of whether the fee is high or low?
I mean, again, just basic like best practices of process management. It actually doesn't really matter as much what direction you're talking about as how you're going about doing it. So if we're talking about allowing some spacing and making smaller changes, then no matter what change you make, there's a reduced likelihood that you're managing the system incorrectly, right? So you're reducing your risk of how you're managing the system. And that's just kind of like, again, basic process management best practices. So that I think should be the top priority. But then we're talking about, okay, when the system is able to withstand a drop in the stability fee, again, maybe give it a couple more days to confirm that there aren't, further economic fallouts, or that there wasn't some external action going on in the market that is covering up the actual effect of the drop in the stability fee, which is, again, totally possible, to allow sort of that dust to settle. I think gives you significantly clearer eyes and a increased degree of confidence that you're making the right change. But assuming that all happens over the next, say 3 or 4 days, then maybe in the following week poll, you do go for, and again, I know some of these options are now getting restricted, but in an ideal world, maybe 0.5% or 1% change. So I do think dropping by 2% is going to be potentially premature. It's not to say it won't work out, but it's just in terms of what options have what degree of confidence of what outcomes. Again, 2% change, I don't see data supporting anything saying that we know that's going to work out all right. But I think we can be far more confident that if there was another 0.5% drop, it's going to work out all right. So that's kind of what I'm going with here is what outcomes do you have what degree of confidence in? And I think the greater the change, the smaller degree of confidence you have that it's going to work out all right. And you're not going to have to unwind it and deal with,
it's the degree of change and confidence in that change is important, but it's also the impetus behind the people that are changing things. That's what I'm trying to wrap my head around, because we fall into this hawks and doves category, which is an easy bucket to separate people into.
Well,
I wonder whether those buckets are in fact stability seekers versus people that are concerned about the competitiveness of the product.
I think it's
Maker?
both. I think it's
product?
holistic, right? So my guess as to motivations, which is, again, not something I'm, really going to do, is sit here and say why people are doing things, and I don't think anybody really reasonably could, but like it does appear to be what's being discussed, at least on the chats, is a combination of DAI price peg stability, but then also competitiveness of Maker and attractiveness of rates. And so there's certainly, logically has to be an element of the quote unquote doves seeking competitiveness of Maker rates and saying, hey, in the event, and we hear this, even on these calls, like in the event that we can drop the stability fee, we should, is I think that camp mentality. And so once the first, once there's blood in the water, maybe, or, once the first drop has been made and everything seems to be all right, then it's no surprise that there is an appetite for further drops, because, then it's, okay, well, we can achieve the outcome, and we being, these doves, can achieve the outcome that is desired, and the system will allow it, Maker voters will allow it, and the peg will sustain it. And so it's maybe a little bit of give an inch, take a mile as well. In the event that the first change was made and the system didn't blow up, people decide to do it again. Makes sense. And the same thing happens with stability fee increases when we're in a very bullish market, and people are saying, hey, well, there's all this leverage. The stability fee was increased. There wasn't, a significant jump in DAI price. That means that there's room to increase it again. And so it's like the same mentality on both sides. Just depends on whether we're talking about a bear or bull market, and different voices take over with kind of actually weirdly the same argument.
I mean, it's almost like there's monetary inertia, just to come up with a phrase, right? Where you make a change, it doesn't really look like anything's happening. You're steering the ship and you keep seeing that you're headed in one direction. So you arc the wheel all the way over because it becomes critical. But by the time you start to unwind it and you start heading the direction you wanted to go, the inertia is still trending the wrong direction. So doing smaller moves with a higher frequency, not frequency in terms of every day, but every other week or whatever the frequency comes out to be, you're saying would have a higher probability of minimizing that inertia and getting us to the right place.
I think there would be pretty definitive reduced process management risk if you made a 0.5% change every 2 weeks and then you just decided what direction that change needed to be, or you agreed that there should be zero change because there's data to support that.
So I think the
at least based on what I've seen so far, yeah.
So I think the inertia point is pretty accurate. I think
I agree.
The main problem is that we make a 2% change and then nothing happens. So everyone's like, well, that didn't work. Let's do it again.
Yeah, everybody's looking for that line. There's no visibility on the line, so you just keep pushing until you push over the line.
Well, that was a conversation that Matthew brought up a long time ago, is the supply and demand buffer, that we don't have quite a clear picture of what that is and how long it takes for it to come into effect, right?
I'm curious what David's saying in terms of feedback. Oh, yeah, I mean, of course, emotional gut reactions.
Yeah, because Chris was like, the more money they stand to make, the louder they'll get. But I don't actually think that that's the case. I think people just kind of have emotional reactions to things like your graph, right? They see certainly for me, I mean, I see for the last 7 days, it's like trading above. Makes me
it's the old zoom out and check the x-axis problem. I think that it's difficult when humans are in charge of this stuff.
Well, that's why I like to show some of the historical data instead of just the more recent stuff, is to just put things back in perspective, because in the grand scheme of things have been comparatively quiet. Supply has been lower, which means excess supply has been lower, which means the effects of leverage are a little bit less exaggerated on things like DAI price.
That's when you zoom out, right? Like if you look at some trusted data at the state of the peg over the last 4 to 6 months, you can basically use it as a ruler. It's fantastically stable, and so micromanagement makes me nervous, I guess.
Yeah, I guess the main Visheshism of the week is the whole process management side of things. I actually really like how you framed it.
I was hoping for an A-team quote, actually. I'm slightly disappointed.
Yeah, I've started to catch on. If I quote a movie or an old TV show, Rich will snag it.
The memetics are strong.
Throw me a bone. Come on, man.
Memes rule crypto.
All right. So I'm not sure where we're at right now. I promised and or threatened questions about governance at the end of the hour. There's a lot of interesting monetary policy things happening though as well. So I think that maybe we'll just roll the dice again and see if we can have a general Q&A session. Because historically, people have been super reluctant just to start asking questions, and I've so much so that I'm considering actually just paying people to start doing it.
So
The first person to ask a good question gets 5 DAI or something.
I want to bring up something first before we jump into Q&A.
You don't have any DAI. You're already getting a salary.
I just wanted to say that our own maker dev Andy Chorley won the East Berlin hackathon, or was one of the winners for building a rate swap. And I think that's pretty cool. And I was also
Yeah,
thinking
and he's
that
on the
maybe
call.
calls he could come and talk about it. Yeah, I know he's on the call. It'd be cool if he could come on and talk about one of these calls.
yeah, I'm gonna
I
invite
wouldn't
him.
mind hearing like a brief recap right now, actually. And like, Andy, are you access to a mic? Like, can you give us like a 2 or 3 minute recap of what you built? Because the rate lock.
I don't want to put him on the spot.
I do. I want to jump on a camera right now and present. Maybe not. All right, but yeah, it would be really interesting because rate swapping is a conversation that we've been having in the community for a long time, and presumably it will unlock a lot of institutional, potentially non-retail interactivity in the ecosystem. So yeah, let's definitely try and get him to do a presentation for us. That's actually an interesting idea, Cyrus. Like, we could probably spice this thing up a bit if we started getting some interesting DeFi players to come in and explain how they're going to fix the space with some of their new tooling.
Yeah. I'm down to have people do this on the community call because I feel like we have a bit more bandwidth to do that there than here. Here we're usually struggling for bandwidth because we have so much to cover.
Yeah, well, it's up for debate. I
Yeah.
like to talk about DeFi stuff here, and community stuff there. But yeah, we'll figure it out. Does anybody want to earn 5 DAI and ask a very piercing question about governance?
I could do it for free. I could do it for free.
Yeah.
So there was a thread on parallelism that I think LongForWisdom posted, or one of you guys.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was. Am I right in understanding that? Because I only remember like briefly reading it. Am I right in understanding that because now we could have concurrent governance polls, why wait too long? Why don't we just throw out like these things that we're polling for, on the forum kind of immediately to governance polls?
Well, yeah, I can easily answer that question because it just started and we're too busy. But the idea is that, yes, the floodgates have been opened and we are now prepared to do all of the things that we wanted to do for the last 6 months. And that's why I brought it up at the top of the hour, specifically calling out the rate stepping and the cadence thing, is that we've had these things percolating. Now we sort of have this, at least a prototypical governance facilitator role here. And so maybe we can assume that that's a thing, and I can take the liberties of starting that stuff up in the expectation that it'll get ratified, or we can just wait a week. But what I would like to do, and reasons why I wanted to talk about in this call, is that I want to sort of formally bring those conversations back to the fore and then apply some of the sophistication that we've created over the last few months. So let's look at LongForWisdom signaling guidelines doc. Let's review the rate stepping and stability fee cadence posts that I put in there at the christening of that forum, I think. And let's formalize them and sort of start it again. And that's, I think, the only kind of rate limiter we have right now with the polling system is going to be cognitive overhead. At some point, we're going to determine what the level of too many things happening in governance is. We might actually be testing that soon enough, but in the interim, we should probably get those things underway. I know that's there's still some discussions to be had and some clarity around what the exponential rate stepping looks like, and why we're doing it and which parameters that would apply to. But these are conversations we should resurrect and polish off, and then see if we can get some momentum there.
I would actually like to just, just for the commentary in general, I mean, for when we deal with things that are related to monetary policy and how we have like system-wide, call it monetary inertia of moving money back and forth, the pragmatic approach of very conservative small movements, like we talked about, probably a very wise course of action. When it comes to just general governance as a whole, I mean, I'm an absolute advocate in violent execution and not waiting for it to be perfect. If we end up with perfect consensus, then there really isn't a reason to have a vote in the first place. So if we get to a point and we just have lots of polls, then we'll get to a point where we hit that limit, fine. But until that point, just violently execute it, even if it's not perfect.
Yeah, well, I think that I agree completely with that model. I think that, like, obviously there's some mid-grounds, and probably we'll drop the violent part of that when we publish the ideas in the forum, but aggressively moving forward with things. But let's iterate. Let's make gather all the available evidence. Let's have a reasonable amount of well-considered conversations, and then let's do things. As long as we clearly understand the risks and benefits associated with whatever activity we're going to take. Keep this show on the road and iterate rapidly as we go along. I think I'm obviously not advocating that, like, let's all switch to liquid democracy tomorrow and see what happens to the MakerDAO ecosystem. That would probably be an ill-considered idea. But if it's let's figure out how to get our governance polls happening quicker than they are already. That's a great experiment. Let's start doing it.
Yeah. So I agree that we should try and make things as gentle. But there's one specific situation that I really want to avoid, which kind of plays into what I'm suggesting that we do. And that is that we have like a majority for something in the forum poll. So like we said, so 20%.
So you're super quiet, LongForWisdom. Can you? You want to do what?
Is that better? No.
I think so. If you've stopped talking, then no. But if
I said a few more things. Okay, so I was saying that there's a specific situation I want to avoid, which is that we get 60% or 70% or some majority in the forum for something, and then we move it on chain thinking that that's great, and then we have one whale that comes in the 30% that like blocks the whole thing. Because
and that's
while that's like valid thing to happen, I think that's going to be pretty distressing for many people that voted in the forum polls.
I agree, and I think that this is something that we need to communicate like over and over and over again. That when we do these forum polls, what we're doing is sort of, well, I hesitate to say democracy, but it's people voting with one person, one vote, presumably. There's no civil protection there, so we can only guess. But it's a signal that gives us enough confidence to move something into a different type of voting system, and that's basically one vote per maker, which is very different than the type of voting that we have in the forum. So we need to understand that when we gather signals in the forums, we're testing the temperature of the room, basically, the very big room. But ultimately, it is up to those whales. That's the system that we built. And we need to accept the fact that this is not a bad thing. This is exactly what we wanted to have happen in the first place. And if we do think it's a bad thing, then we have to change it all. And we should start talking about that. I have no idea what that would even look like, but we could figure that out. But if it turns out that 100% of people in the forums want to do one thing and two whales don't, and it doesn't happen, then that's the world we live in. We need to solve that problem. And we could either revamp all of governance, or we could start exploring other options like the delegation, self-organization. How do people start collaborating? How do they campaign? Like, this is something that I've been talking about too more and more, is that we need to transition away from people saying, I think we should do some X in a tiny little forum post, and move towards, okay, if the people in the forums want to do something, then they need to consider tweeting about it, and or talking to other people about it, and or creating some kind of compelling blog post about why something should happen, and then trying to convince the whales what they should be doing. And if that doesn't work, then they should organize, and then they should make their own whale and move the system in the ways that they want to move it.
I have a question. Is there any appetite in me starting to mock up the vote delegation stuff?
Possibly. So here's the problem with this. We put out a help wanted post in the forums. Lots of people have already just chatted here and there about the need and or desire to have a delegation system. A handful of people have expressed interest in doing it, and only one team has shown any sort of long-term commitment to that idea. So it would be my preference that the people that are actually likely to pull this thing off would get into a chat with each other and try and pool resources and get on the same page. So Chris Hogcroft, I don't know if you know him or of him, but I can put you in contact with him, and I'm reasonably sure he would be enormously happy to have the additional help, or at least you guys can coordinate.
Right. He's the one working on the Aragon proposal, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
You guys could at least spec it out and or figure out whether your visions align. And if they don't align, it's a big community, so you guys can compete and get two different options going. There's all kinds of stuff that can happen here. Like Aragon, who knows, maybe Aragon is not the greatest solution. I think it feels to me intuitively like all the frameworks are there and we don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, and it comes with the UI, which is nice. So,
but who knows, there might be a blocker, or maybe somebody can just whip together a better solution too. So competing solutions would be great. So if you have something in mind, God's law, ping me and I'll put you in contact with either Chris, or we can try and get something else in to go. I think the UI stuff is going to be important. It's the UX stuff is going to be even bigger, and then figuring out the complexities around custody. I think for this to work, it needs to. This kind of a process is ripe for exploitation. So if somebody can come along and have all the best intentions, but once they have 50,000 Maker under their belts, they might realize some of their darker natures have come to the fore, or somebody could just be a huge scam artist. We need to make sure that people that are staking their Maker and allocating voting rights to somebody else are doing it in a way that's safe and recoverable and all the rest. So there's some complexities that need to be figured out there. Was there some questions here? 75%, what's going on?
I was just talking about the thing I said.
I had a question, Rich, about the duration of the polls for ratifying the mandates. And if you have any...
Yeah, can you talk louder than the train dude? I can hear you very well.
Last week we talked about how we'd have some arbitrary discussion time followed by the poll, but I don't think we talked about how long the poll might reasonably last. Like, have we considered doing like a 3-week poll or a 4-week poll, just letting that run in the background during the discussion itself? So maybe
for the
starting the
mandates or for something else?
For the mandates.
Yeah, well, I think this is our first kick at the can, and so a lot of these dates are arbitrary, and I think that there was a slight pushback in that it felt like we were imposing, restrictive timelines on people, which I can assure you was not the case. But people can find conspirators wherever they look, I guess. But we have no idea what the community's appetite is for any of these things, and so we need to do it a couple times to figure that thing out. And so the rough guess was 2 weeks to talk about a mandate, and then 1 week to poll for it in the forums, and then 1 week to do it in the governance portal. Maybe that sounds good enough. We'll see how it goes. But I think we're going to have to iterate. And that's one of the things that the metaphysical things I wanted to talk about in this call too, but we're running out of time, is how much debate is enough? And at what point do we determine that consensus has been reached? Because reading through those mandate threads, you kind of have to do a sentiment analysis with like, was there any major flaws determined in this mandate? Are people generally accepting of these things? And the problem is there's no algorithms for that. So somebody has to make a decision, and making that decision is risky, because then human frailties come into play. But the short answer is I have no idea. I think the community needs to let us know, like, hey, the next time around, we need to be able to talk for a month in the forums, and we need to have 3 weeks in the, I don't know. We need to figure it out. I have no answers for that. Was that LongForWisdom? You were going to say something?
Yeah, just that I think the polls can help mitigate the need for that sentiment analysis you were talking about, right?
Well, yeah, so here's my issue is that I'm very, very hesitant to put out a mandate and then attach a poll to it and say, like, what do you guys think? Because these conversations go back and forth for weeks at a time, and very compelling arguments happen, and then maybe somebody comes in and says, okay, yeah, right, let's change half that mandate. And then at that point, we have a poll that's super stale, that's based on the people that voted initially were basing their votes on old and outdated information. We have to guess, did anybody come back and update their votes? I have no idea. So what I'd really like to see is that we have a proposal goes in the forum, we have a debate that lasts for X amount of time, and then once the debate dies down or some kind of consensus has been reached, or whoever submitted that proposal is now unwilling to make any further changes, they just want to get a signal out of it, then that poll gets tacked onto the thread. And then we can set some kind of arbitrary timelines for how long that poll lasts. Like, I'm a much bigger fan of that idea, because at least we can have this assurance that everybody is voting on the same picture, as opposed to various versions of that picture that they might have stumbled on.
There are other ways of solving that problem, though. You can create a poll when it goes out the first time, and then as soon as you make any significant changes, you can close the poll and start a new one. Like, there are other solutions to that
Sure,
other than waiting for the discussion to finish before starting a poll.
I guess, but like, what's the benefit of just so say that we had a proposal, a poll, and then 3 other versions of that poll as we go along until, I don't know. So what would we do with the iterations of those opinions over time? Would we discard the first ones, or would the first ones color the second ones? Or can we expect that people would come back over and over again to reevaluate?
You have to hope that the latest one is the most representative, right? Like, it also lets you see that if you make a change and you end up with like less consensus than you did before, you can then see that and then go back to a previous version.
Yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, okay, yeah, well, yeah. Let's continue to talk about it and let's see what works. I keep on coming back to not turning MakerDAO into work for people, and trying to present as much data with as little overhead and time requirements as we possibly can. So if we're talking like the exponential rate stepping thing, you talked about that before, where we're constantly hovering back and forth between 60% approval of one of these slight variations in the rates. And my concern is that people they get sick of this stuff after a while, and we can't expect 50, 100, or 1,000 people to be watching this forum thread to keep up to date with the last quote storm quote reply storm that occurred.
Yeah,
we need to figure out how to summarize and say, okay, hey, we've all talked this thing to death. This is the final version of the thing that we want to get a signal on. Here's the thing where you signal. And then we can all have some confidence that that maximized the interaction and has the cleanest signal to noise ratio. But like you said, there's arguments to be made that we can track sentiment over time, or we can, I don't know. It's going to be complicated. I think that we should figure out a plan, play with it, and see what works and what doesn't, and then next time around iterate. I think the good place to start with that would be the signaling guidelines doc, which is why I posted that earlier. That I would love to people to dig into that and get it internalized, offer some suggestions, and then we can put it into the portal as being like this canonical doc about how you do signaling in the forum threads.
Yeah, I agree. It needs more eyes on, really. It's mostly like my summary of things people said like a month ago.
Yeah, it's sort of a testament, well, at least anecdotal evidence about turning MakerDAO into work, where last night it was like 11 at night, and I was thinking, okay, I should go into that guidelines thing and add all the arguments for and against the stuff that I just said. Like, let's do debates, let's do proposal, let's do debate, let's do poll, and then let's do formal governance poll. And then I was like, oh man, this is too much work. I have to go to bed. So I didn't do it. So we have to ask ourselves, people that aren't drawing a salary from the foundation, how much work are they going to do for us in these things as well? So we need to try and make things as easy as possible without making them too dumb, I guess.
Yeah, agree.
All right, so we're at 30 minutes past the end of the hour. Yeah, it is my personal problems, and they're all now everybody else's problems too, immortalized forever on YouTube's and in the transcripts. Half hour past the hour. It's half past the hour, so let's put it to bed. Thanks everybody for the lively discussion. Thanks to Cyrus and to me and to Matthew and to Vishesh for the interesting discussions. Please, if you have questions that weren't addressed or you have other things you want to talk about, join the forum. There's almost too many really interesting discussions happening right now. Get informed. Vote on the risk team mandate and the governance facilitator mandates. There's going to be up for another 4.5 days, and then we'll move it into the governance portal and see what people say there. All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you, everybody.